May 27, 1942, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning sun reflected off the calm Pacific. But inside Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's headquarters, the air was tense and electric. The wall clock read exactly 800 hours. Lieutenant Commander Edwin T. Layton stood at attention, holding a folder so thin it could have been dismissed as unimportant. Yet within it lay intelligence so precise, so unbelievable, that it defied conventional understanding of warfare. "The Japanese are coming to Midway." Layton began, his voice steady. "They will approach from the northwest on a bearing of 325 degrees. They will be sighted approximately 175 miles from the island. The attack will commence at 0700 hours on June 4th. For a brief moment, Nimitz said nothing. His face, calm, analytical, measured, revealed little. Then, in his deep Texas drawl, he asked, "You're telling me you know exactly where Yamamoto will be, when he will arrive, and what he plans to do?" "That's correct," Sir Layton replied. "We can read every order, every position report, every communication between Japanese commanders. We know their entire battle plan." The room fell silent. For the first time in the Pacific War, the United States Navy possessed something far more powerful than any battleship, any carrier, any bomb: the ability to read Japan's mind. That single morning briefing would set in motion a battle historians would later call the turning point of the Pacific War. But the story didn't begin that day, not even that year. It had taken 2 decades of invisible warfare, pencil-paper mathematics, and the patient labor of men working in dimly lit basements far from the front lines. The triumph Layton presented to Nimitz was the culmination of an intelligence revolution, a fusion of cryptology, linguistics, and machine-assisted analysis that transformed how nations fought. It was the moment information became a weapon as decisive as steel. The roots of that moment stretched back to the early 1920s. After the chaos of World War I, a quiet but visionary officer named Lawrence F. Safford foresaw that the next great conflict would not only be fought on the seas or in the skies, but in the ether across invisible waves of radio transmission. In 1924, he convinced the Navy to establish its first cryptologic unit. Its budget was tiny, its staff just a handful of officers, but its purpose was revolutionary: to understand and eventually to control information. Safford gathered men who saw patterns in noise logic, in randomness, mathematicians, linguists, and radio operators capable of isolating whispers from the air. These early pioneers formed the Navy's OP-20G, the predecessor to what would later become the National Security Agency. One of his earliest recruits was a young sailor named Joseph Rochefort. He had enlisted at 17, lying about his age, driven by a fascination with puzzles and systems. While most men went to sea, Rochefort went into language. He mastered Japanese, lived in Tokyo for years, and learned not only how the Japanese spoke, but how they thought. He would become in time the architect of one of the greatest code-breaking operations in history. Rochefort's early exposure to Japan's culture and hierarchy gave him a rare advantage. He noticed patterns others ignored, subtleties in syntax hierarchy, in military phrasing, even psychological clues in how Japanese officers composed their dispatches. It was this human understanding that later gave technical breakthroughs their meaning. By the mid-1930s, the U.S. Navy had positioned listening stations across the Pacific in Hawaii, the Philippines, and Washington. Together they formed a triangulated ear across thousands of miles of ocean, capturing enemy transmissions from static-filled airwaves. Then, in 1939, Japan unveiled a new encryption system, JN-25, the 25th known naval code identified by American cryptologists. It was far from simple and enciphered code using dual-layer encryption. Each word or phrase was represented by a 5-digit code group drawn from a 33,000-entry book. Then, Each of those numbers was altered again, an additive process that shifted every digit based on another secret table. The result was chaos, a stream of meaningless numbers that resisted all pattern. To decipher even a single message, analysts first had to strip away the additive layer, then match the remaining code groups to their meanings without having access to the original codebook. It was like trying to reconstruct an entire language from overheard fragments of conversation, while the enemy constantly changed dialects, yet the Americans and their British allies persisted. By 1940, they had recovered perhaps 10% of the JN-25 system. It wasn't enough to read messages fluently, but it was enough to glimpse meaning in the fog. Then in December 1940, Japan replaced the entire system with a new version, JN-25B. Overnight, 2 years of work were rendered useless. The Codebreakers had to start from zero. Still, they refused to quit. By late 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor, they had identified around 1,500 code groups progress, but not enough. Then, on December 4th, Japan changed the additive tables again, a routine update that cut off what little visibility the Americans had regained. 3 days later, the sky over Oahu turned to fire. When Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the men of the Navy's code-breaking sections felt the shock in their bones. To them, it wasn't only an attack, it was a personal failure. They had been so close to seeing the pattern, so close to warning their commanders, and yet blind at the crucial moment. But defeat often breeds innovation. In June 1941, months before the attack, Rochefort had taken command of Station HYPO, a secret cryptanalytic unit buried beneath the 14th Naval District building at Pearl Harbor. Few outside even knew it existed. Behind its plain concrete walls was a 60-foot-long windowless room lined with clattering IBM tabulators, maps, and endless racks of punch cards. It was there underground that the United States would begin to turn the war around, not with guns, but with pencils, wires, and intuition. Rochefort was not the kind of officer Washington understood. He wore slippers and a smoking jacket, lived on coffee and cigarettes, and often worked 3 days without sleep. But he had an unshakable belief that any codes could be broken. He built a team to match that belief, mathematicians, linguists, and even musicians, men whose sense of rhythm and pattern recognition could spot hidden symmetries in walls of numbers. Their mission was singular: to penetrate JN-25B, whatever the cost. What none of them yet knew was that their work and their exhaustion would soon converge into one of the greatest moments of analytical brilliance in modern warfare, a victory not of weapons, but of understanding. Because by spring 1942, the men of Station HYPO were about to read Japan's most closely guarded secret and hand Admiral Nimitz the map to victory. By early 1942, the men of Station HYPO were living inside a world of numbers, endless 5-digit blocks streaming across teletype rolls like mechanical rain. Each code group was a riddle, and each message was a test of endurance. The analysts worked in rotating shifts that often blurred into 36 or 48-hour marathons. The sound of clattering IBM punch card tabulators never stopped. The smell of tobacco and machine oil filled the basement. Commander Joseph Rochefort presided over it all, unshaven, exhausted, wearing his signature smoking jacket. The Navy bureaucracy in Washington found him eccentric, even insubordinate. But to his team, he was a leader who demanded precision and gave loyalty in return. He had hand-selected his crew: Thomas Dyer, the mathematician who turned the IBM machines into analytical engines; Alva Laswell, a linguist fluent not just in Japanese words, but in the culture behind them; Ham Wright, the code theorist who could visualize encryption layers like three-dimensional puzzles; Joseph Finnegan, the date-time expert, whose pattern recognition bordered on genius; and a host of enlisted operators, many of them former band musicians from the battleship USS California, sunk at Pearl Harbor, whose rhythmically trained minds could detect recurring number sequences faster than any machine. Rochefort believed that cryptanalysis was a form of music, a rhythm in chaos, he once told a colleague. And indeed, every man at HYPO lived by that rhythm: intercept, decode, compare, hypothesize, test, repeat. The work was painfully slow. Each intercepted Japanese message might contain 200 5-digit groups. Analysts first had to remove the additive if they could identify it, then try to match each group to a meaning in the partial codebook they were rebuilding from scratch. Most lines remained nonsense, but occasionally a fragment would break free: a ship name here, a date there, a phrase like departure ordered or air strength confirmed. From these fragments, the team built a picture, a mosaic of enemy intentions. When they couldn't read the content, they studied traffic analysis: who was sending to whom, how often, and from where. A sudden spike in messages from the combined fleet headquarters to a particular task group meant planning. A call sign that went silent implied a fleet at sea. Even the spacing of transmissions, the strength of radio signals, or the time of day could reveal clues about Japanese movement. It was a form of intelligence born not from visibility, but from inference and art, as much as a science. By February 1942, just 2 months after Pearl Harbor, Station HYPO achieved the first tangible progress against JN-25B. Working with the sister stations cast in the Philippines and the Washington Navy Yard section, they began recovering segments of the new additive tables. For the first time, they could read parts of the encrypted traffic. Not sentences, just 1 word in 5, sometimes less, but enough to sense intention. That single insight was transformative. The Americans learned that the Japanese were preparing operations in the South Pacific, first New Guinea, then the Solomon Islands. Their reports reached Admiral Nimitz within hours, allowing him to reinforce Port Moresby just before it was attacked. The system was working. Rochefort's men, however, paid a steep price. They rarely saw daylight. The fluorescent lights gave everyone a pallid complexion. Their eyes burned from staring at columns of numbers. Coffee and cigarettes replaced food and sleep. They joked that they were the Navy's underground half-alive fighting a war no one could see. Yet morale remained fierce. They knew that every pattern they uncovered could save thousands of lives. By April, their partial breakthroughs had expanded. The IBM machines, each the size of a desk and operated by women from the Navy Clerical Corps, now processed thousands of punch cards daily. The machines could only find repetition, meaning still required human intuition. As Dyer once explained, the machines don't break codes, they just whisper hints. People do the rest. Those hints began converging into something ominous. Messages referred repeatedly to an upcoming operation against an objective designated AF. The term appeared again and again, sometimes in logistics orders, sometimes in carrier dispatches, sometimes in high-level fleet communications. Every analyst at HYPO circled it in red pencil. What was AF? The codebook indicated that the letter A prefixed locations in the Central Pacific AH had referred to Oahu AO to the Aleutians. By that logic, AF likely pointed to something near Hawaii. The small Midway atoll 300 miles northwest of Honolulu fit perfectly. Strategically, it was the outer rampart of the U.S. defensive line. If Japan captured Midway, Hawaii itself would lie exposed. Rochefort was convinced AF is Midway, but Washington disagreed. The Navy's Central Intelligence Office under Admiral Ernest King believed AF referred to something else, perhaps Johnston Island, or even an operation in the South Pacific. King had long distrusted Rochefort, seeing him as a rogue officer who bypassed hierarchy by communicating directly with Nimitz through Leighton. In Washington's view, Hawaii's cryptologists were overconfident. For Rochefort, It wasn't just a bureaucratic argument, it was existential. If he was wrong and Nimitz deployed the fleet incorrectly, the United States could lose its last 3 carriers, Enterprise Hornet and Yorktown. Japan would command the Pacific unopposed. He needed proof. Enter Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, a former journalist turned intelligence officer with a flair for deception. Holmes proposed a simple but ingenious test. If AF was truly Midway, and if the Japanese were monitoring American communications, why not feed them a story? Midway would broadcast an unencrypted message, something mundane but specific, describing a local crisis. If Japanese intercepts then repeated the same information using AF, the identification would be confirmed. Nimitz approved. On May 19, 1942, Midway transmitted a routine-sounding report. Water distillation plant broken down. Fresh water urgently needed. The message was deliberately left uncoded so the Japanese could hear it. 2 days later, HYPO intercepted a Japanese dispatch from Tokyo to the combined fleet. After painstaking decryption, it read, AF reports water shortage. Supply ships to provide fresh water for forthcoming operation. The basement erupted. There were no cheers, just the quiet hum of realization. AF was Midway. There was no longer any doubt. With that single deception, Rochefort's team had exposed Japan's next major operation and given Nimitz the chance to set a trap that could change the course of the war. But the clock was ticking. The Japanese fleet was already assembling. Time, the one element no machine could decode, was running out. Now, HYPO's analysts turned their exhausted minds toward the next question. When would the attack come? Because if they could predict not just the target, but the exact hour the Americans would hold the ultimate weapon foresight, and that was something Japan never imagined possible. In the final days of May 1942, the basement of Station HYPO no longer felt like a workplace. It was a war zone of minds. The IBM machines clattered without pause, stacks of punch cards grew like dunes along the tables, and the air reeked of sweat and machine oil. Men spoke in fragments, thinking in numbers instead of words. Somewhere between the static and the cigarette smoke, the pieces of the Japanese plan were taking shape. The confirmation that AF meant Midway electrified the room. For months, they had been fighting to prove they could read the Japanese system at all. Now their work was the difference between survival and disaster. The challenge ahead was clear. Find the date and time of attack before the enemy reached the island. The Japanese were masters of operational security. Dates were not written plainly. They were wrapped in multiple layers of encryption. The date-time groups in JN25 were super-enciphered with additional mathematical steps meant to resist pattern recognition. Even if an analyst stripped away the additive, the date still looked like nonsense. But one man at HYPO saw through the fog. Joseph Finnegan, a mathematician with a quiet demeanor and a mind built for pattern logic, spent sleepless nights staring at number grids. He began to notice something strange, recurring relationships between certain code groups. They weren't random. Through months of trial and error, Finnegan developed what he called a 12x31 garble check, a grid-based test that aligned recurring sequences with calendar possibilities. It was equal parts math, intuition, and madness. On May 25th, Finnegan cracked it. Using his method, he isolated the Japanese date-time encryption pattern and found the operational window the first week of June. He leaned back in his chair, eyes bloodshot, and whispered, "They're coming June 4th. When Rochefort reviewed the calculations, he immediately summoned Leighton. The date fit every other clue fuel schedules, call signs, and traffic bursts all aligned around early June. For the first time in history, an entire naval battle could be mapped before it even began. Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor headquarters, Admiral Chester Nimitz was balancing the impossible. The U.S. Navy had only 3 operational carriers in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Yorktown had just limped back from the Coral Sea, her decks torn, her systems crippled. Naval engineers estimated she would need 3 months of repairs. Nimitz gave them 3 days. He knew the stakes. The Japanese would attack with at least 4 carriers, the Akagi Kagasoryu and Hiryu veterans of Pearl Harbor. Supporting them would be battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and a full invasion convoy. If Nimitz positioned his carriers wrong, the Pacific Fleet could be wiped out in a single blow. So he made his decision based entirely on intelligence. He would trust Rochefort's men. He would gamble the fate of the Pacific on a handful of codebreakers in a basement, and the gamble would be worth it. From May 25th to May 27th, HYPO worked non-stop. Finnegan's date-time groups revealed not only the attack date, but the structure of the Japanese fleet: 4 carriers approaching from the northwest, a diversionary strike to the Aleutians, an invasion force trailing behind, and a submarine cordon meant to intercept any American reinforcements. The precision of the decoded orders was astonishing. One intercepted transmission decrypted on May 26th even revealed the Japanese intended to launch aircraft at dawn from a distance of roughly 175 miles on a bearing of 325 degrees from Midway. It was the final piece of the puzzle. On May 27th, at precisely 0800 hours, Lieutenant Commander Layton entered Admiral Nimitz's office for the daily intelligence briefing. The folder he carried contained humanity's most valuable weapon knowledge. Nimitz listened without interrupting as Layton outlined the Japanese plan approach: vector launch, distance, target, timing. When Layton finished, the Admiral sat back and asked only one question. "How certain are you?" "Completely, Sir," Layton said. "This isn't analysis. We're reading their operations orders." Nimitz nodded, once the kind of small, decisive gesture that altered history. "Very well," he said. "We'll be there waiting for them." From that moment, the entire Pacific strategy pivoted. Instead of reacting to Japan, the United States would move first. The hunters were about to become the hunted. Nimitz ordered Enterprise and Hornet to sail under Admiral Raymond Spruance, while Yorktown, still undergoing frantic repairs, was pushed through the night by 1,400 civilian workers at Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. The men welded by floodlight, eating cold sandwiches as they cut and riveted steel. To provide electricity for the welders, Honolulu experienced rolling blackouts for 3 straight days. On May 30th, just 72 hours after entering dry dock, the Yorktown steamed out to sea, her decks still scarred, her paint still wet. Civilian engineers remained aboard, continuing repairs as the ship joined Task Force 17. Across the Pacific, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's combined fleet was already underway, a massive armada spread across thousands of miles of ocean, guided by a confidence born of 6 months of victory. Japan believed the Americans were broken, hesitant, and blind. Yamamoto expected surprise. Instead, he was sailing directly into an ambush planned by men who could read his thoughts. This was the silent duel of the Pacific, an unseen chess match between 2 commanders separated by thousands of miles, but connected by invisible signals. For Japan, secrecy had always been its weapon. Now secrecy had become a liability. Every radio transmission was a leak, every order a gift to the enemy's decoding machines. As Nimitz positioned his carriers north and east of Midway, his confidence was absolute. For the first time, an admiral could plan with near-perfect foresight, an advantage unprecedented in military history. Intelligence had replaced luck. Still, even Nimitz could not ignore the risk. The Americans were outnumbered 2-to-1 in carriers, 4-to-3 in decks, and nearly 3-to-1 in total aircraft. If the timing was even slightly off, the Japanese could catch his task force unprepared. But Nimitz had a quiet faith not in luck, not in firepower, but in mathematics. "Rochefort's boys haven't been wrong yet," he told Layton. When Yorktown joined Enterprise and Hornet in open sea on May 31st, the trap was set. Task Force 16 and 17 would wait in radio silence, their exact positions known only to Nimitz and Leighton. Midway itself braced for impact, reinforcing its runways and anti-aircraft batteries. Reconnaissance aircraft patrolled the empty blue horizon, and in that small, humming basement under Pearl Harbor, the analysts of Station HYPO continued working not to celebrate their success, but to anticipate the next move. Each decoded message could still alter the outcome. Each delay could mean disaster. In war, there are moments when the future shifts, when victory no longer depends on strength, but on what one side knows before the other does. May 27, 1942 was that moment, the day Admiral Nimitz realized he could see his enemy, the day information became the deadliest weapon in the Pacific, June 1, 1942. The Pacific stretched endlessly beneath the morning sun, serene, deceptive, silent. Somewhere across that expanse, two fleets moved toward each other, one certain of victory, the other certain of knowledge. The Japanese combined fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was the most formidable naval force ever assembled. 4 of Japan's premier fleet carriers, Akagi Kaga Soryu and Hiryu, sailed with 248 aircraft flanked by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Their crews were battle-hardened, their confidence absolute. From Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, they had crushed every opponent they faced. Yamamoto believed his strategy was flawless. He would lure what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap near Midway Atoll, destroy America's carriers, and open the door to invading Hawaii itself. Tokyo's propaganda machine was already drafting victory headlines. But Yamamoto didn't know that in the basement of a nondescript building at Pearl Harbor Station, HYPO had turned his masterpiece of deception into a mirror, one that revealed every move he made. Inside that windowless cryptologic bunker, Rochefort's team still labored through the nights. The operation's success depended on precision. They couldn't afford even a single misread character. Japanese communications were still flowing, and HYPO needed to confirm that nothing in the enemy's timetable had changed. The analysts refined their decrypts, cross-checking every figure, every phrase. Their notes covered the walls, coordinates, bearings, dates, fleet call signs. On May 31st, they intercepted confirmation that the Japanese carriers would strike at dawn on June 4th. That message sealed it. The trap was ready, but outside the world of numbers and logic, men were preparing to fight and die. At Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, 400 civilian workers had performed the impossible. They had repaired USS Yorktown in 72 hours, patching bomb holes, replacing decks, welding cracked bulkheads, and even repainting her hull. The ship left the dock with workers still aboard finishing repairs as she sailed. It was a symbol of the American spirit, steel and sweat fused by urgency. As Yorktown joined Enterprise and Hornet under Admirals Frank Jack Fletcher and Raymond Spruance, the odds were still daunting. The U.S. had 233 carrier aircraft to Japan's 248 close, but Japan's pilots were veterans, many of them elite survivors from Coral Sea and Pearl Harbor. In raw experience, the Japanese still held the edge, yet war was changing. The Americans had information, the ultimate equalizer. Admiral Nimitz positioned his carriers northeast of Midway in an area where the Japanese least expected them. If Yamamoto's fleet followed its predicted path, 325° bearing from the northwest, the Japanese strike force would fly directly over the American trap. From June 1st onward, all U.S. communications were sealed. Nimitz enforced strict radio silence. Only essential orders passed through secure channels. He told no one outside his immediate circle that the Japanese code had been broken. Even fleet commanders not directly involved in the operation were kept in the dark. The secret was too valuable to risk. Meanwhile, on Midway itself, U.S. Marines and Navy crews worked feverishly to fortify the island. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned along the atoll's narrow runways. B-17 bombers and PBY Catalina patrol planes were stationed in rows, engines idling day and night. Pilots slept beside their planes. The tension was physical, like a bowstring drawn to its limit. In Washington, skepticism still lingered. Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, remained unconvinced that AF was indeed Midway. He had little trust in Rochefort, whom he saw as a maverick operating beyond the chain of command. But Nimitz ignored the politics. "I'll take his word over any man's in Washington," he told Leighton. Rochefort's earned it. While analysts on the mainland debated abstractions, the men at Midway prepared for annihilation. They knew that on paper they were outnumbered and outgunned. But they also knew something Yamamoto didn't, that the enemy's plan was already written in their hands. At dawn, on June 3rd, American PBY patrol aircraft began long-range sweeps to the west. The sky was clear, the sea deceptively calm. Every hour that passed brought them closer to confrontation. Then late that afternoon, a PBY spotted something, a Japanese supply convoy 700 miles west of Midway, steaming toward the atoll. The report was radioed in immediately. Confirmation the enemy was coming. That night, Admiral Spruance addressed his air crews aboard Enterprise. He told them they were likely to face 6 Japanese carriers and that survival would depend on striking first. His words were measured, but carried the gravity of history. "This is our chance to stop them. We won't get another." In the early hours of June 4th, radar screens on Midway began to light up with blips, dozens, then hundreds of them. At 07:02 hours, just 2 minutes after Leighton's prediction, the island's defenders saw dark shapes emerging over the horizon. Japanese bombers approaching from the northwest, exactly as HYPO had foreseen. Inside Nimitz's headquarters, Leighton stood silently as reports came in over the teletype. The bearing, the distance, the timing, all correct. Nimitz looked up from the message and said dryly, "Off by 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles." It was a moment of vindication, not just for the intelligence officers who had labored in the shadows, but for the idea that knowledge could outmatch numbers. As the first bombs fell on Midway's runways, the island's anti-aircraft guns thundered back. The sky turned black with smoke and contrails. On the surface, the Pacific boiled with chaos, fire oil, and steel. But miles away over the curve of the horizon, 3 American carriers waited silent and unseen. The trap was set. While Japan believed its strike had caught America off guard, its own fate was already sealed by its overconfidence by the invisible war it had already lost in the rooms beneath Pearl Harbor. In that underground labyrinth, Rochefort's team was still decoding fresh intercepts, even as the battle began. Their teleprinters clacked with new traffic, Japanese after-action reports, pilot check-ins, fleet orders. The analysts were now fighting in real time, tracking the enemy's confusion and feeding it up the chain to Nimitz. The battle that was about to unfold wasn't just fought in the skies above Midway. It was fought in the silence below, in the rhythm of IBM machines, in the smoldering ashtrays, in the sleepless logic of men who had turned thought into weaponry. And as dawn broke over Midway, that weapon was about to strike back. June 4th, 1942. Dawn broke across the Pacific with deceptive calm. The sun rose behind the low clouds as Japanese carrier planes roared toward Midway, their formations tight, their confidence unbroken. To them, the element of surprise was certain. The Americans, they believed, were still licking their wounds in Pearl Harbor. But 200 miles to the northeast, in waters the Japanese thought empty, 3 American carriers waited, Enterprise Hornet and Yorktown engines, humming decks crowded with aircraft, fueled, armed, and ready. The trap designed in the basement of Station HYPO was now set on the open sea. At 07:02 hours, radar operators on Midway reported multiple inbound formations bearing 325° ground range, 175 miles, exactly as predicted by Leighton's decrypted analysis. 2 minutes later, bombs began to fall. The atoll erupted in flames, runways cratered, anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly into the rising sun. The Japanese first wave, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, executed their attack with mechanical precision. Yet as their aircraft wheeled away from the island, they had no idea they had already lost the war's most decisive battle. They just didn't know it yet. From the deck of the Enterprise, air crews ran to their planes. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, gave a simple order: launch everything we have. Attack the enemy carriers immediately. By 0720, U.S. carrier planes were taking off in waves, torpedo squadrons low and heavy dive bombers climbing high into the morning sky. Coordination was imperfect, communication spotty, but urgency overrode order. Every pilot knew this was the moment that would decide the Pacific. As the Americans ascended into the bright sky, the Japanese strike leader Lieutenant Tominaga circled above Midway assessing damage. His report back to the carrier, Akagi was confident the airfield was heavily damaged but not destroyed. A second strike would be required to finish the job. Aboard Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the carrier strike force, faced a fateful decision. His original plan called for a second wave against Midway, but reports of American ships in the area, uncertain, fragmentary, forced him to hesitate. Should he rearm his planes for another land strike or prepare them with torpedoes for an unexpected sea engagement? He chose to rearm. Below decks, ordnance crews scrambled to swap bomb loads. Fuel lines snaked across the hangar floors, torpedoes were uncrated, and deck crews worked shoulder to shoulder in the cramped spaces. The Japanese carriers, moments before models of precision, had become floating powder kegs, and above them unseen American planes were closing in. At 0920 hours, the first U.S. aircraft made contact Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. 29 pilots dove low over the ocean, charging directly into the wall of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Without fighter escort, they were slaughtered, every aircraft shot down. Not a single torpedo found its target, but their sacrifice achieved something extraordinary. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol 30 fighters had descended to sea level to engage the torpedo bombers. The sky above the fleet was now empty. Moments later, from 14,000 feet, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown emerged from the clouds. The timing was accidental perfection. Guided by a lone scout plane's desperate report, they found the Japanese fleet exactly as HYPO's intercepts had predicted: 4 carriers grouped tightly decks, cluttered with fueled aircraft and live ordnance. At 10:20 hours they dived. From the sunlit heights, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led his squadron into a near-vertical plunge. Bombs screamed through the sky and struck with surgical precision. The Akagi took a direct hit on its flight deck. Seconds later, Kaga and Soryu were engulfed in explosions. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning their crews, trapped amid fire and steel, their pride erased by fate. The shock aboard the Japanese fleet was total. Radio operators screamed orders that no one could execute. Anti-aircraft gunners fired blindly into empty sky. Commanders ran across tilting decks as fuel lines ignited and aircraft detonated in chain reactions. From the Enterprise, pilots watched the inferno and realized the magnitude of what they'd done. Lieutenant Richard Best, who had scored one of the direct hits, recalled the moment later. It was as if the ocean itself caught fire. We knew then Japan would never recover, but the battle was not yet over. At 10:30, the 4th Japanese carrier Hiryu launched its counterattack. Her dive bombers found the Yorktown, the ship that had been miraculously repaired in just 3 days. 2 bombs tore through her decks, igniting fires deep below. Though the crew fought valiantly, Yorktown was dead in the water. Hours later, Japanese torpedoes from a follow-up strike finished her off. Yet even as Yorktown slipped beneath the waves, American aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet located Hiryu. In the late afternoon, they descended in another coordinated dive. Within minutes, the last of Japan's 4 carriers was aflame. By nightfall, all 4 Akagi Kaga Soryu and Hiryu were gone. In exchange for 1 American carrier and a destroyer, the United States Navy had destroyed Japan's striking arm, the very carriers that had bombed Pearl Harbor. In total, Japan lost 4 carriers, 250 aircraft, and more than 3,000 men, many of them irreplaceable veteran pilots. The Pacific balance of power shifted in a single day. When Admiral Nimitz received confirmation of the victory on June 5th, he simply said, "Well done, boys. Well done." In the basement of Station HYPO, Rochefort's men didn't celebrate. They just sat in silence, staring at the teleprinter as battle reports rolled in. They knew what few others did, that this victory had been won long before the first bomb fell. It had been won in patterns and logic, in the endless hum of machines and minds that had pierced the enemy's soul. The Battle of Midway was not only a triumph of courage and strategy, it was the birth of modern intelligence warfare, proof that information properly decoded could shape destiny. The Japanese Empire would never again seize the initiative. And the world had just witnessed the moment where mathematics, language, and human will converged to turn the tide of history. June 5th, 1942. The Pacific was a graveyard of steel. Smoke still curled from the horizon, where 4 of Japan's mightiest carriers had sunk beneath the waves. The victory at Midway was so complete, so sudden, that even Admiral Nimitz struggled to grasp its full magnitude. What had begun as a desperate gamble guided by a handful of cryptanalysts in a windowless basement had become the turning point of the entire Pacific War. But in the aftermath of triumph came the quieter war, the struggle to protect the secret that made it all possible. Inside Station HYPO, Joseph Rochefort's team didn't cheer. There were no victory cigars, no parades. They simply kept working, intercepting Japanese transmissions, stripping away additives, analyzing traffic. The battle had been won, but the Code War was far from over. They knew that if the Japanese ever realized their communications were compromised, they would change their entire cryptographic system overnight, erasing months, perhaps years of work. So HYPO did what the best intelligence units always do. After a success, they said nothing. The decrypts that had given Nimitz the edge at Midway remained classified at the highest level. Only a handful of people, Nimitz, Layton, and a few others, knew how much of the victory had been written in code rather than blood. For the men who had fought in the skies and on the decks, the aftermath was grim. The ocean was littered with oil slicks, life rafts, and burned wreckage. Rescue teams searched through debris for survivors, both American and Japanese. Pilots from both sides floated for hours surrounded by sharks and wreckage. War was merciless, even in victory. But in Washington, the news hit like lightning. The same bureaucrats who had doubted Rochefort's analysis were now forced to confront the fact that a handful of basement mathematicians had delivered the most decisive American naval victory since the Spanish-American War. Even President Roosevelt was astonished. "This must never leak," he said. "We cannot risk the enemy learning how it was done." Still, the bureaucracy in Washington, led by Admiral Ernest J. King's intelligence staff, the Redmond brothers, viewed HYPO's independence with suspicion. They believed Rochefort had acted outside the chain of command by communicating directly with Nimitz. The politics of credit began even before the bodies at Midway were recovered. Rochefort's contribution, though monumental, was quietly minimized in official reports. Meanwhile, the strategic implications of the victory rippled across the world. Japan had lost its elite pilots, men who could not be replaced. American intelligence estimates showed that by 1943, Japan would be training its air crews in half the time using inferior aircraft and deploying them in smaller formations. The Imperial Navy's aura of invincibility had evaporated. According to a 2017 RAND analysis of historical intelligence cycles, the lessons from Midway remain among the most studied in military history how the synergy between cryptology and command decision-making turned the tide of war. The report emphasized what modern intelligence officers call fusion dominance, the ability to combine signals, human insight, and operational analysis into a single decisive picture. That was exactly what Nimitz and Rochefort had achieved in 1942, decades before the term even existed. In Tokyo, Yamamoto was stunned. His fleet had vanished, his air crews lost, and his strategic plan to draw out and annihilate the U.S. carriers had failed catastrophically. He called it the greatest tragedy of the war. According to post-war Japanese archives, Yamamoto's staff initially believed that bad luck, not intelligence failure, had doomed them. The idea that the Americans had penetrated JN-25 seemed unthinkable. And so, unknowingly, Japan kept using the same cryptographic systems. This gave HYPO and later the new code-breaking network known as FRUPAC Fleet Radio Unit Pacific an unparalleled advantage for the rest of the war. Within weeks, the analysts were reading new intercepts about Japanese fleet movements, supply convoys, and troop deployments. In one message decoded in early 1943, analysts learned that the Japanese were constructing new airfields across the Solomon Islands. That intelligence shaped the Allied counteroffensive, the campaign that began with Guadalcanal. From that point forward, every major U.S. naval operation in the Pacific was influenced by intelligence derived from JN-25 decrypts. Historians often describe Midway as a miracle. But miracles, as Rochefort would say, are usually the result of hard work done quietly. For Admiral Nimitz, the aftermath of the battle demanded not celebration, but calculation. He knew that Japan would strike again, perhaps not immediately, but soon. His job was to maintain the initiative to keep pressure on an enemy now forced into a defensive war. Intelligence would remain his compass. He reorganized the Pacific Fleet's intelligence operations, placing HYPO at the center of a network that extended from Hawaii to Australia. Nimitz also understood that secrecy was paramount. He forbade any mention of the code-breaking success in official communiques or press releases. Even the officers who had flown at Midway were told nothing. They believed their victory was due to luck, to the courage of the pilots, or divine providence. In truth, it had been secured in numbers and logic. That secrecy nearly collapsed just weeks later. On June 7, 1942, the Chicago Tribune published a front-page story headlined, "Navy Had Word of Japan's Plan to Strike at Sea." The article, written by war correspondent Stanley Johnston, implied that the U.S. Navy had advanced knowledge of Japanese plans dangerously close to exposing the code-breaking operation. President Roosevelt and Navy Secretary Frank Knox were furious. They demanded prosecutions under the Espionage Act. The FBI launched an investigation. Yet in the end, the grand jury declined to indict. The Japanese never read the article, or if they did, they didn't understand its implications. The secret of JN-25 remained intact. The Tribune incident is still studied today in intelligence courses as an example of how fragile victory can be when built on hidden knowledge. One newspaper headline could have erased an entire strategic advantage. Back at HYPO, Rochefort continued to push his team harder than ever. They had broken one code. Now they faced constant updates, new additives, and revisions. The work never ended. But the human toll was real. Analysts suffered from exhaustion, malnutrition, and insomnia. Some began hallucinating number sequences even in their dreams. "We were living inside the enemy's brain," one cryptologist later said. "Sometimes we forgot which side we were on." Rochefort himself was running on caffeine and sheer willpower. When his superiors in Washington, the Redmond brothers, accused him of overstepping his authority, Nimitz defended him personally, calling him the indispensable man of Pearl Harbor. But Washington politics eventually caught up. Despite having delivered one of the greatest intelligence triumphs in U.S. history, Rochefort was quietly removed from his post in late 1942 and reassigned to oversee floating dry docks on the West Coast. To many of his colleagues, it was an act of bureaucratic betrayal. Yet Rochefort never complained. The work was never about glory, he told one interviewer years later. It was about saving lives. He was right. By the end of 1942, American forces were advancing across the Pacific, not through blind courage, but guided by intelligence that had its roots in that same dimly lit basement. HYPO's legacy was spreading, even as its creator faded into administrative obscurity. The Battle of Midway had proven a profound truth about warfare in the modern age. Information once weaponized could shape the fate of nations. And in June 1942, a handful of men with pencils, IBM punch cards, and sleepless determination had shown the world just how powerful that weapon could be. By the summer of 1942, the tide of the Pacific War had begun to shift, not through sheer firepower, but through knowledge. The victory at Midway had revealed that mastery of information could defeat even the most powerful fleet in the world. Yet for the men of Station HYPO, their war was far from over. Joseph Rochefort's basement operation continued to hum IBM punch cards, clattering cigarette smoke, thick in the recycled air, and analysts hunched over cipher tables that mapped the rhythm of an empire. Their task was no longer to prevent another Pearl Harbor. It was to make sure Midway's miracle was repeated again and again across Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and beyond. The Japanese Navy, unaware that its codes had been compromised, continued to use JN-25. They changed additives and call signs, but the structure remained the same. The Americans adjusted instantly. Within weeks of Midway, new intercepts provided insights into fleet redeployments, logistics routes, and fuel shortages. The intelligence was pure gold. It told Nimitz not only what the Japanese were planning, but what they feared. In August 1942, as U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal Station, HYPO began intercepting desperate Japanese messages about resupply attempts, the so-called Tokyo Express. Through decrypted traffic, American commanders learned the precise timing of night convoys bringing reinforcements to the island. Allied forces ambushed these runs, repeatedly crippling Japan's ability to sustain its troops. This was a new kind of warfare, not just planes and ships, but invisible strikes. Each cipher broken was a torpedo in disguise. Meanwhile, the human cost inside the cryptologic rooms remained unseen. Analysts slept on cots, rarely saw daylight, and suffered nervous breakdowns from the unrelenting mental strain. "We were at war," one veteran later recalled, "but our front line was a typewriter." By late 1942, bureaucratic storms brewed back in Washington. The Redman brothers, Commander Joseph and Captain John Redman, resented Rochefort's direct communication with Admiral Nimitz. They believed intelligence should flow through their Washington-based command, not through independent outposts like HYPO. In their view, Rochefort's methods were unorthodox and undisciplined. To the cryptologic community, that independence was precisely his genius. But in the rigid world of naval hierarchy, brilliance without obedience was a sin. By October 1942, despite his irreplaceable contributions, Rochefort was quietly removed from Station HYPO and reassigned to a logistical post managing dry docks on the West Coast, a posting he viewed as exile. His replacement was technically capable, but lacked Rochefort's instinct for language culture and the intuitive leaps that had cracked JN-25 in the first place. Even Admiral Nimitz's personal endorsement couldn't save him. In his memoirs, Nimitz later admitted, "It was one of the gravest administrative mistakes of the war." Rochefort never complained publicly. He continued to serve quietly, overseeing ship repairs, while the intelligence machine he had built powered on. The men he trained remained Laswell, Finnegan, Wright, and they carried on his methods, continuing to break codes faster than the Japanese could replace them. In 1943, that continuity bore one of the most precise assassinations in military history, Operation Vengeance. American cryptanalysts decrypted a JN-25 message detailing a planned inspection tour by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. The message included his itinerary aircraft type and exact coordinates of flight. Nimitz authorized an interception. 18 P-38. Lightning fighters flew from Guadalcanal, navigating 500 miles of open ocean, using only dead reckoning and faith in the decrypted data. On April 18, 1943, they found Yamamoto's transport precisely on schedule. The Admiral's plane was shot down over Bougainville. Japan's most revered strategist was dead. For the first time in modern warfare, a commander had been killed through intelligence-derived targeting, a method that would define conflicts decades later. This operation, declassified decades later, is now studied at institutions like the Naval War College and RAND's Center for Security Studies. Analysts note that Midway and Operation Vengeance together marked the birth of target-centric warfare, where information, not ordnance, determines victory. Yet the architects of that revolution remained uncelebrated. Rochefort's dismissal symbolized the paradox of intelligence work. Its greatest victories must remain invisible. Back in Hawaii, HYPO continued to evolve. The cryptologic unit expanded, merging with other Pacific intercept stations into the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific FRUPAC. Its reach extended to Australia, the Aleutians, and even Indian Ocean monitoring stations. Japanese communications, naval, merchant, and even diplomatic flowed through the network daily. Analysts could now map not just battles, but Japan's economy. They read messages about oil convoys from the Dutch East Indies, steel shortages in the home islands, and desperate pleas from island garrisons running out of food. By late 1943, intelligence analysts could quantify Japan's decline month by month. American submarines guided by decrypts began hunting Japanese merchant shipping with lethal efficiency. By 1944, according to post-war reports from the U.S. Navy's submarine force, 55% of Japan's shipping losses were the result of operations supported by ultra-intelligence derived from the very systems HYPO had pioneered. The results were catastrophic for Tokyo. Japanese industry began collapsing under the weight of supply strangulation. Factories lacked fuel, aircraft sat idle, and food shortages spread across the empire. The war that had begun with the illusion of invincibility was now being suffocated by mathematics, and through it all, the myth of Japan's unbreakable code persisted. Incredibly, even after Yamamoto's death, Japanese high command assumed the Americans had simply gotten lucky. Pride blinded them to the truth that the very structure of their communications network was compromised beyond repair. In Washington, politics moved slowly toward justice. In late 1942, Nimitz nominated Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal, calling him the man whose brilliance and courage made victory possible at Midway. The recommendation was denied by Admiral King, still under the influence of the Redmond brothers. It would take 44 years for the U.S. government to correct that injustice. In 1986, President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal in a White House ceremony attended by his surviving children and senior intelligence officials. The citation read, "For exceptional meritorious service whose brilliance and untiring efforts were largely responsible for the victory at Midway." Vice President George H.W. Bush himself, a former naval aviator, said quietly afterward, "Every man who came home from the Pacific owes something to Joseph Rochefort." By then, the cryptologic world had changed. The National Security Agency had been established in 1952, inheriting many of the system's doctrines and analytical methods born in Rochefort's basement. His fingerprints were everywhere in how analysts correlated signals, in how commanders were briefed, even in how secrecy was enforced. But for those who had worked under him in 1942, the memory was simpler. He taught us, one of his translators recalled, that victory doesn't come from louder guns, it comes from clearer thinking. The battle for Midway had ended 4 years of Japanese expansion. But the real revolution, the birth of the modern intelligence age, had begun in that same week, in that same concrete room beneath Pearl Harbor. The war would rage on through the jungles of New Guinea, the skies over Leyte, and the firestorms of Tokyo. But from that moment forward, the United States fought with knowledge as its most reliable weapon. Information had become armor, and in the years that followed, no Japanese admiral would ever again sail confidently into battle, because unseen, unheard America was already listening. By early 1943, Japan's empire still stretched across the Pacific, but its communications had become its undoing. Every message sent from Tokyo to Truk, every order relayed from Rabaul to the Solomons pulsed invisibly through the ether, and across that ether, American ears were listening. Station HYPO's successors, now consolidated under the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific Frupak, had turned information into a weapon sharper than any blade. Inside a reinforced bunker near Pearl Harbor, a generation of cryptanalysts worked in shifts that blurred into each other, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The sound of clattering IBM punch-card machines never stopped. Rows of operators typed intercepted Japanese transmissions onto cards that were fed into sorting machines to detect recurring number patterns. Each 5-digit block represented a word, a location, or a ship, but with layers of additive encryption stacked on top. Where once it had taken months to solve even a few phrases, now, Frupak's network could process thousands of messages per week. Mathematical techniques pioneered by Joseph Finnegan and Thomas Dyer, refined through trial exhaustion and sleepless intuition, allowed analysts to strip additives algorithmically. The process was still done with electromechanical devices, but it represented an early form of what the post-war world would later call machine learning. Every breakthrough at HYPO and later Frupak had something in common, a combination of human insight and mechanical calculation. The machine could find patterns one cryptanalyst recalled decades later, but only a person could understand what those patterns meant, and the meaning was devastating for Japan. By the spring of 1943, Frupak was reading an average of 15–20% of JN-25 traffic in near real time, a rate unheard of in wartime cryptology. These decrypts provided not only tactical data convoy routes, fuel levels, departure dates, but also the strategic heartbeat of Japan's war effort. The empire's supply arteries were being mapped in detail. That map became a kill list. American submarines began to lie in wait along the very coordinates decrypted from JN-25 messages. The result was an industrial collapse by stealth. In 1943 alone, nearly 1.5 million tons of Japanese shipping were sunk, most of it guided by intelligence from HYPO's cryptanalysts. Each merchant vessel lost meant fewer raw materials reaching Japan's factories, fewer soldiers supplied on faraway islands, and a growing realization within the Imperial Navy that something inexplicable was happening. They could not understand how the Americans seemed to know every convoy route, every rendezvous point. Rumors spread through Japanese naval circles. Spies in the Admiralty radio leaks even divine intervention. But no one suspected that the Americans had been reading their mail since before Midway. In the United States, the impact of that invisible war extended beyond tactics. The Office of Naval Intelligence ONI, the Army's Signal Intelligence Service, and British Codebreakers at Bletchley Park began sharing breakthroughs across the Atlantic. This collaboration, codenamed Ultra-Pacific, would later form the backbone of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which endures to this day. The philosophy was simple: secrecy saves lives, but shared intelligence wins wars. By late 1943, the fruits of that philosophy were visible everywhere. The U.S. Navy launched Operation Galvanic, the invasion of Tarawa and Makin in the Gilbert Islands, with precise knowledge of Japanese troop strengths and airfield readiness. FRUPAC decrypts had revealed that local garrisons were undersupplied and that reinforcements were delayed by mechanical breakdowns in the transport fleet. Nimitz's staff exploited this timing, perfectly striking before Japan could respond. The victory came at terrible cost. Thousands of Marines died storming fortified beaches, but the broader effect was clear. America now dictated the tempo of war. Each assault from the Gilberts to the Marshalls to the Marianas was preceded by weeks of code-breaking and signal monitoring. Even as American bombs fell, analysts back in Hawaii and Australia were already decrypting the enemy's next move. And yet, the deeper story of HYPO's legacy was not told to the men who fought on the beaches or the pilots who flew into anti-aircraft fire. They were never told that many of their lives were saved by the quiet calculations of people they would never meet, mathematicians, linguists, and typists who never left their windowless rooms. In 1944, that unseen network achieved one of its greatest victories. Decrypts revealed that the Japanese combined fleet under Admiral Toyota was preparing a massive counteroffensive Operation Ago, designed to halt the American advance at the Philippine Sea. The decoded orders provided exact carrier departure times, flight schedules, and even fuel constraints. When Admiral Raymond Spruance read the intercepts, he reportedly said, "They're coming right into the trap," and so they did. In June 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American pilots shot down more than 350 Japanese aircraft in what they mockingly called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The victory shattered the remaining Japanese naval air arm. It was Midway repeated on an even larger scale, another ambush made possible not by luck, but by the unseen hand of intelligence. By this point, the Japanese Navy's radio men were changing frequencies almost daily, trying desperately to conceal movements. But FRUPAC's algorithms evolved faster. For every code the Japanese replaced, American cryptanalysts broke the next within weeks. The U.S. advantage had become structural, a combination of superior industry computing capacity and cryptologic innovation that Japan could never match. Yet even as the intelligence war widened, Washington's own infighting continued. The Redmond brothers, still influential in naval intelligence headquarters, sought to downplay Rochefort's role in Midway's victory, presenting the success as a collective bureaucratic achievement rather than the work of one maverick genius. Their political maneuvering ensured that for decades the name Rochefort remained largely absent from official Navy histories. But within the inner circles of cryptology, his legend endured. Younger analysts, men who would later serve in Korea, Vietnam, and the Cold War, kept his methods alive. His principles became doctrine. Intelligence must serve the commander directly. Speed matters more than perfection. Truth requires intuition as much as mathematics. Those doctrines live on in today's National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command. While bureaucrats debated credit, the war rolled on, and the fruits of HYPO's methods continued saving lives. Each intercept shortened Japan's reach. Each decoded coordinate brought American bombers closer to Tokyo. By late 1944, decrypts revealed the Japanese were running dangerously low on aviation fuel. Their carriers were sailing without aircraft, their pilots flying without training hours. When American submarines sank the Taiho, Japan's last operational fleet carrier, it was another victory, written first in a cipher room, not in the sky. But perhaps the most haunting part of this story is how few of those who made it possible ever received thanks. When the war ended, the men and women of FRUPAC were sworn to silence under threat of imprisonment. They could not speak of their achievements, not even to family. Many went to their graves without anyone knowing that they had helped turn the tide of the Pacific. Only in the late 1970s, when the National Security Agency began declassifying wartime decrypts, did the truth finally emerge. Historians pored over reports labeled ultra, realizing that these cryptic typed summaries were the real architects of Midway, the Philippine Sea, and ultimately Japan's defeat. The more they read, the clearer it became. The Allied victory in the Pacific was not won solely by aircraft carriers or industrial might, but by information gathered, decrypted, and acted upon faster than the enemy could react. The Pacific War had proved a new law of modern conflict. Whoever controls information controls destiny. And at the center of that revelation stood a man in slippers and a smoking jacket in a basement under Pearl Harbor, a man who saw patterns in chaos and gave his nation the power to see the unseen. By 1945, Japan's empire was collapsing not in sudden defeat, but in a slow, methodical strangulation of its logistics and morale. Every ship sunk, every convoy intercepted, every ambush predicted, traced back directly or indirectly to the cryptologic work that began in Joseph Rochefort's basement 3 years earlier. The tools of victory were no longer battleships and bombers alone. They were intercepts, radio frequencies, and patterns in silence. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's Signals Directorate was bewildered. Transmissions that should have been secure were somehow leading to disaster after disaster. Entire convoys vanished without trace. Yamato-class battleships, symbols of national pride, sailed on operations that Allied submarines and aircraft always seemed to anticipate. The Japanese suspected espionage, but had no proof. The truth that American cryptanalysts had been reading their highest-level naval codes in near real time remained unthinkable. The consequences were total. By mid-1944, Japan had lost 2/3 of its merchant fleet. Its oil supply had collapsed by 85%. According to post-war studies by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Japan's industrial output fell to less than 30% of pre-war levels. Fighter aircraft sat idle for lack of aviation fuel. Entire island garrisons were abandoned, not defeated in battle, but starved by intelligence-guided blockades. Every major engagement in the final 2 years of the Pacific War, from the Battle of the Philippine Sea to Leyte Gulf to the defense of Okinawa, was shaped by decrypts originating from Frupac's descendants. Each battle confirmed a terrifying truth for the Japanese high command: their enemy not only outproduced them, but outthought them. When American bombers finally appeared over Tokyo, Japanese commanders already knew too late that their communications had been their undoing. Inside HYPO's successor facilities, however, victory did not look like triumph. The cryptologists rarely saw sunlight, rarely left their posts. When Japan's surrender was announced in August 1945, many of them simply kept working, decrypting messages about repatriation, disarmament, and the return of prisoners of war. We didn't celebrate, one linguist later recalled. We just switched from war traffic to peace traffic. For these men and women, the war had never been about glory. It was about precision, duty, and silence. Their victory was written in numbers, not medals. But in the post-war years, silence became erasure. The American public knew little of Station HYPO or Frupac. In popular memory, Midway's triumph belonged to the aviators, the brave men who had dived through flak and fire to destroy Japan's carriers. Hollywood told their stories in films like Midway 1942 and 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. The cryptanalysts forbidden to speak faded into obscurity. In Washington, the Navy's intelligence establishment, still influenced by the Redmond brothers, ensured that Rochefort's name did not appear in the official reports of the Battle of Midway. They described the intelligence success as a collective achievement of the Office of Naval Intelligence. Bureaucratic politics had rewritten history, but among those who knew Nimitz Layton and the few surviving HYPO veterans, the truth endured quietly. When Nimitz wrote his post-war reflections, he described Rochefort's team as our silent partners in every victory. Edwin Layton, his trusted intelligence officer, later published "And I Was There," restoring Rochefort's place in the story and revealing for the first time the extent of HYPO's contribution. By the 1950s, the lessons of HYPO had evolved into doctrine. The newly formed National Security Agency NSA absorbed many of its veterans and methods. Computers replaced IBM punch cards. Algorithms replaced frequency tables. Yet the mindset, the fusion of logic, culture, and intuition remained pure Rochefort. Analysts now studied his work as foundational. They called it pattern intelligence, the recognition that every adversary, no matter how disciplined, leaves a fingerprint in data. Whether through repetition of codes, timing of transmissions, or silence in the ether patterns reveal intentions before actions occur, that principle born at HYPO would define not just World War II intelligence, but the entire Cold War to come. The Soviet Navy, Chinese military networks, even modern cyber operations, all are studied today through frameworks pioneered by Rochefort's team. In 1986, when President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal, the citation did more than honor one man. It formally acknowledged that the Battle of Midway, the decisive event in the Pacific, was won as much by thought as by courage. Reagan's speech, drafted with input from naval historians and the NSA, contained a single line that summed up the ethos of every cryptologist since. He turned information into strategy and strategy into victory. That same year, the Naval Cryptologic Veterans Association began its tradition of leaving a single red carnation on Rochefort's memorial stone each June 4th, the anniversary of Midway. The flower's meaning was symbolic: red for sacrifice, white for truth, and the two together for unseen heroism. Yet even today, few Americans can name Joseph Rochefort. His story, like the story of the Akutan Zero, the Doolittle Raid, and countless other intelligence miracles, remains overshadowed by the roar of engines and the flash of battle. But among historians, his reputation has only grown. Modern military academies, Annapolis, West Point, Sandhurst, now teach the Battle of Midway, not merely as an operational victory, but as the birth of cognitive warfare. A RAND study published in 2020 describes it as the first modern demonstration of decision dominance, where information superiority turned uncertainty into tactical control. The study's conclusion was blunt. Midway's outcome could not have occurred without cryptologic mastery. Looking back, it is clear that the Pacific War was not just a contest of armies and fleets, it was a war of minds. The Japanese trusted secrecy. The Americans trusted comprehension. The Japanese believed in divine destiny. The Americans believed in pattern recognition. One philosophy looked inward. The other looked outward to the data, the noise, the invisible web of human behavior. And in that contrast lay the future of warfare. The legacy of HYPO stretched far beyond 1945. Its spirit resurfaced during the Cuban Missile Crisis, in the NSA's SIGINT operations in satellite surveillance, and later in the digital age. Every time a modern commander receives intelligence that changes a decision in real time, they are knowingly or not echoing Rochefort's model, the idea that foresight is the most powerful weapon of all. In a way, the ghosts of Station HYPO still whisper through every encrypted channel, every intercepted signal. The language has changed from Morse to binary, from radio static to quantum ciphers. But the principle remains identical. Find the pattern before the enemy finds you. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the men who won Midway. Before it began, they proved that intelligence, when wielded with discipline and imagination, can rewrite the very geometry of war. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world stood at the dawn of a new era, one defined not by the clash of empires, but by the silent wars of information deception and technological supremacy. The atomic bomb would end the Second World War, but it was signals intelligence that had made such an ending inevitable. From the humid basements of Pearl Harbor to the radar domes of the Marianas, America had discovered a new weapon, one measured not in megatons, but in knowledge. The architects of that revolution, the men of Station HYPO, were already being forgotten by the time Japan signed its surrender aboard the USS Missouri. Their names didn't appear in victory parades or on medals. There were no ticker tape celebrations for analysts who had stared at endless columns of numbers until they blurred into meaning. Yet it was those patterns decrypted, cross-referenced, and analyzed that had turned the tide of war. For Admiral Chester Nimitz, the realization of that power had come on May 27, 1942, when Edwin Layton stood before him and declared, "We can read every order, every position report, every communication between Japanese commanders." 3 years later, that statement had become not just an intelligence feat, but the doctrine of an entire military age. In the decades following the war, that doctrine would evolve into what modern strategists call information dominance, the ability to see, understand, and act faster than an adversary. The path from Rochefort's clattering IBM machines to 21st century cyber warfare runs in a straight line. The principles of pattern analysis, encrypted communication, and operational secrecy have not changed, only the tools. In a 2017 RAND Corporation report titled Intelligence in the Age of Algorithmic Warfare, analysts described Station HYPO as the first laboratory of the information century. The report argued that Rochefort's integration of human intuition with machine-assisted computation anticipated the foundations of modern artificial intelligence. Every predictive model used by today's intelligence agencies, from drone surveillance to network intrusion detection, echoes that same synthesis of human insight and data processing born in 1942. But the lesson of HYPO was never purely technological. It was moral and philosophical. Intelligence, Rochefort often said, was about understanding people, not just codes. He had spent years in Tokyo learning the nuances of Japanese thought and communication, knowing that culture itself was a cipher. That empathy, the willingness to see the world through an adversary's logic, became a hidden advantage in the Pacific War. It remains one of the defining challenges of intelligence work today, to know not only what the enemy says, but what he believes. After the war, many of Rochefort's protégés carried that ethos into the Cold War. They joined newly formed agencies like the NSA-CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency, transforming signals intelligence into a permanent pillar of national defense. The United States entered the atomic age with an unprecedented capability to listen, interpret, and predict, a capability that prevented nuclear crises, exposed espionage networks, and guided presidents through moments of existential peril. From the Cuban Missile Crisis to Operation Desert Storm, the fingerprints of Station HYPO's legacy can be found in every major intelligence success. The meticulous traffic analysis techniques used against Japanese convoys evolved into satellite tracking systems during the Cold War. The additive strip methods used on JN-25 inspired the first digital encryption breaking algorithms. Even the architecture of modern command centers, where analysts and commanders share information in real time, follows Nimitz's model of trust between field leadership and cryptologic specialists. But the personal stories behind that legacy are just as vital. Rochefort lived out his remaining years quietly, never publicly claiming credit for Midway. When he died in 1976, his obituary in the New York Times was only a few paragraphs long. It mentioned that he served in naval intelligence, nothing more. The secrecy he had lived by followed him to the grave. Only a decade later did history begin to correct itself. When President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal in 1986, it was more than a decoration, it was an apology written in bronze. At the White House ceremony, Vice President George H.W. Bush himself, a former Navy pilot who had fought in the Pacific, said simply, "The Admiral trusted him, and because of that trust, the free world was saved 1,000 times over." Today, the Navy's intelligence school in Virginia Beach bears Rochefort's name. A portrait of him hangs in the main hall, slippers on his feet, pipe in hand, eyes half-lidded in the exhaustion of genius. Every new intelligence officer who passes through that hall learns the same creed: accuracy, integrity, silence. It is the inheritance of Station HYPO. Modern cryptologists still study the JN-25 case as an archetype not just of code-breaking, but of analytical reasoning under pressure. The ability to derive meaning from fragments, to connect dots across incomplete data, to act with confidence in uncertainty, these are the hallmarks of great intelligence work. In an era of artificial intelligence and machine learning, those human qualities remain irreplaceable. And yet the broader story of Midway carries a timeless warning. Information can win wars, but it can also create arrogance. The same mastery that allowed America to read Japan's secrets later tempted it into overconfidence in other conflicts. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, where cultural understanding lagged behind technological prowess. The lesson Rochefort taught, that empathy is as vital as encryption, is one that modern intelligence communities continue to relearn, sometimes painfully. Looking back from the vantage of history, the battle for Midway was more than a naval confrontation. It was the first modern battle for information sovereignty. It demonstrated that in war, as in diplomacy and economics, victory belongs not to the strongest, but to the most informed. That realization reshaped not only military strategy, but global politics. By the late 20th century, the information revolution, from early computing to the internet, was built on the same principle that guided HYPO: data is power. The networks that once carried enemy codes now carry global commerce, communication, and conflict. Every nation, every corporation, every hacker chasing secrets across fiber optic cables walks in the shadow of those first cryptologists who proved that information could decide empires. The story of May 27, 1942, remains a touchstone in military academies around the world. In lectures at Annapolis, young officers still study the exchange between Nimitz and Leighton, not for nostalgia, but for insight. How does a commander trust intelligence that seems too precise to be real? How does he balance skepticism with decisiveness? The answers lie in that morning at Pearl Harbor, when a handful of analysts gave their commander the courage to believe in the unseen. The result was not just the Battle of Midway, but the birth of a strategic mindset that endures in every intelligence operation since. So when historians say that Midway marked the turning point of the Pacific War, they are only half right. It was more profoundly the turning point in how wars themselves are fought, from brute force to informed precision, from reaction to anticipation. From that day forward, no great military power could afford to fight blind. The age of information had begun not in Silicon Valley, but in a dimly lit basement under Pearl Harbor. On that day, May 27, 1942, Admiral Nimitz didn't just learn Japan's secrets. He learned the future of warfare. And in doing so, he and his unseen allies changed the course of human history.